the mistake this realtor made, in my opinion, and TCs, if you're watching this, let me know what you would do in this situation. TC with Lily, a day in the life of a real estate transaction coordinator. Let's get into it. In today's episode, I'm going to break down a scenario I went through this week about names on title. As a real estate transaction coordinator, it is vital that we bring attention to anything that might seem odd or off or wrong and do our best to get those resolved. As a real estate transaction coordinator, the very first thing you want to check when proceeding on with a new contract is the vesting. You want to find out who exactly title is being held under so we can guarantee that whoever they are, or if it's one person, a bunch of people, that they're all signing all of the contracts and all of the disclosures. Otherwise, it's just going to become a whole new set of work in the future. So as soon as we get any new contract, whether it's a listing or a sale, it's important that we get a copy of the preliminary title report. And this can be obtained from escrow through their systems, and you just send your request out. But it's important that we open pre-escrow early and we get a copy of that report. The sooner the better. Or if we're in contract, we want to open escrow as soon as possible, because we want to verify said information. So I was in a scenario where we didn't have a prelim, and yes, you could check the tax records, but sometimes the tax records aren't always up to date, or they don't list everyone who is on title. So we want to verify that information on the prelim. Basically, we had that situation where a contract was signed, but we didn't have a prelim yet, and I was requesting disclosures. We got the disclosures, but even then, it was still all just signed by one person. So I requested a prelim on my end and continued on with my process. I've encountered many realtors that grow very impatient when it comes to sending their clients documents. They typically want to skip steps and just get them everything as soon as possible. And they have the mentality of, we'll fix it later, in a sense. And for me, I'm like, I would rather do it all up front versus having to come back to it later and create this bigger mess. So what I'm getting at is the file that I had listed just one seller. And even all of the disclosures, all the contracts were all signed by just one seller. So then I think like 3 days into contract, I get an email from the listing agent who emailed myself and the buyer's agents, the agents I'm working with, asking us, do you want me, this is the listing agent, do you want me to email the second seller all of the disclosures now? And keep in mind, this person is not using a TC. He even in the first initial emails in the first 24 hours said, I'm taking on this file as my own TC. And I was like, okay, that's normal, also keeping in mind if he needs one in the future. But I thought it was kind of odd that he asked us that question 3 days into contract, because generally, especially up here in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we do everything pre-escrow, meaning we have all of the disclosures, the reports, all handy and ready to be viewed by anyone that requests a copy. So when he brought that up, and then I finally get the prelim, and I go look back and look at the prelim, and lo and behold, there are 2 sellers on title. So unless they're adding new information to disclosures or to the contracts, then all this second seller needs to do is technically just sign everything that is, come across all of our desks, the contracts, the disclosures, any reports if applicable. So it's not that big of a deal. It's definitely becomes contractual if that second seller came in and just redid the whole TDS, then that then gives the buyers more time to make a decision, and it could potentially kill the whole deal. But basically, in the event where there are 2 sellers on title, you want to get both of them to sign everything together. Now, I don't know her story. I don't know if she was in the Amazon and had no reception for months and she just got back and is now ready to sign everything. I don't know her story. I don't work with that side. I'm not working with that side of the transaction directly. But now that I'm aware of her existence, there will come a point where we are going to need her signatures on everything. So from the buyer's perspective, all I have to do is just make sure from now on both sellers appear on all contracts and disclosures. And as long as nothing changes in terms of disclosure, meaning if this second seller comes in and discloses anything about the property, then that could ultimately affect the transaction. But for now, we just need signatures. Now, if you're a TC on the listing side and you come across that situation where you find out later, or you might have missed checking the prelim, or the prelim came in after the fact, and you learn that there's a second seller on title, or a third or fourth or fifth, you have to go back and make sure they sign everything. Now, the mistake this realtor made, in my opinion, and TCs, if you're watching this, let me know what you would do in this situation. Is, God forbid the deal falls out of contract, right? But if you're the listing agent and you're having the second seller sign documents with buyers' names and signatures on them, if this deal were to fall out of contract, that second seller is still going to have to go back and re-sign all of the original disclosures with just the seller's information on there. Because if this deal falls out of contract and they have to relist the property, you can't reuse disclosures that have already been executed by a buyer. It's just not morally, ethically, and probably legally right. It's just not, and it doesn't look good. You want to leave those spaces blank for the next buyer to sign. And then, it'll raise questions like, why are these signatures here? Who are they? And you could just be creating a whole bigger mess for yourself. So best case scenario, as soon as you get a listing, if you're a transaction coordinator, get access to that prelim as soon as possible. You could find the vesting typically on the first couple of pages. It's usually just vested in, and then it'll have a name. It's usually like a line or a couple lines, and it'll tell you if it's like a single, joint tenancy, an LLC, a trust, anything of that nature, it will say it there. And if you ever have any doubts, you can contact your agent, you can contact escrow, but it's important that we get the correct names on every single contract and disclosure. Otherwise it will create double the work for you later, and that's no fun. That's no fun at all. So this is just one of those scenarios. I want to do more of these like scenario talks here on YouTube, because, or at least in video form, so that way you can have someone out there that allows you to feel like you're not alone in this situation. Because I think if I had not been doing transaction coordination for many years, if I was a brand new TC, I probably wouldn't know what to do in that situation. So I'm giving you an insider view of a day in the life of a transaction coordinator. And this is one of those days where now, just when you think you have a clean deal, you're having to go and backtrack a little bit to make sure all of those people have been signed, and getting the proper paperwork in order to disclose the fact that this second seller exists. And it just creates more work and takes up more time. But all of this could have been avoided had the listing agent had her sign, or had the second seller sign alongside the first seller. But like I said, I don't know what her situation was, and maybe she just wasn't available to sign initially, or maybe he thought it wasn't that big of a deal. I think in terms of time and energy and legal purposes, just in case, it is a big deal. It is, because it slows down all of our processes and adds double. Now he has to do this twice. And maybe they're divorced, maybe they are separated, or maybe she said, I refuse to sign anything until we have a buyer. There's so many different scenarios where a seller or a buyer won't sign things until certain steps have been completed. So like I said, I don't know what the second seller's reasons were for not signing, or if the realtor thought that that's the order in which things operate. But as a TC that's been in the game for many, many years, it was very rare that I ever saw someone have their client sign at two completely different times. So if you ever run into that situation where you're unsure about the vesting, or if someone should be signing or should not be signing. There's a few people you can ask. Go to your agent, talk it out with them. If they get stuck or they're not sure, you can always go to escrow, give escrow a call, email, or you could go to your broker, because ultimately these transactions belong to the broker. If anything were to go down legally or illegally, the broker is the one that's going to get in trouble the most. So in any event, if you ever run into issues with vesting, it's best to slow down, take your time, cross-reference all paperwork, and make sure everything is in alignment before you move on and go deep into that file. Because if you realize a couple days in or a week in or right before you close that there was another whole seller, a whole nother person that should have been on title, it could ruin and delay and pause and possibly hurt that transaction. So the sooner we learn, the better. And there have been scenarios too nowadays, especially with the way the market is in the year 2022. A lot of buyers are starting to be added to contracts at the last minute. So these are things that happen. But on the seller side, I personally don't think there's an excuse for sellers to not sign everything up front and together. Not necessarily sitting next to each other, but definitely, all right, I'm going to go send it to this person on DocuSign, and then I'll send it to this person next. They're signing orders. They don't even have to communicate with each other if they're not in communication. But anyway, I feel like I'm rambling now. That is just one of those situations, a day in the life of a transaction coordinator, a real estate transaction coordinator, where the seller is there are two sellers having to go back and re-sign everything or sign everything for the first time. And thankfully in this situation, it didn't affect the file, but at the same time, it just to me didn't make sense on how things were taken care of and they were done. But if you ever run into a situation like that or let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. And if you have any questions you'd like me to answer on here, I'm definitely open to doing that. You can leave a comment below, DM me across all social media at Transaction Care. And my name is Lily, and this is TC with Lily, a day in the life of a real estate transaction coordinator. And I'm so thankful for your time. I have a podcast. I do have a podcast. It's called Transaction Care across also podcast platforms. I like Apple, I like Spotify. Those are my two places where I listen to podcasts the most. So go check it out. I've basically transferred the whole demystifying the business of real estate concept into the podcast, and YouTube and video format is going to be focused purely on a day in the life of me as a transaction coordinator, what I'm doing in real estate, how I'm pivoting, how I'm transitioning, if I'm getting licensed anywhere else, how I've dealt with certain scenarios and situations, answering questions from social media that are directed more towards like me as a singular person living in this real estate world. Whereas the podcast is going to be introducing guests and other point of views and perspectives within the real estate industry, some conventional, some unconventional, but I'm having a lot of fun doing both. So I appreciate your time. Your time is worth it. And head to transactioncare.com to learn more about my services as a transaction coordinator, as well as the podcast, the YouTube show, merchandise coming soon. All of that lives at transactioncare.com. Join my community. My TC community is the best. We talk weekly, and I also do YouTube lives here. So if you want to know when those things are happening first, because my TC community gets everything first. Okay? First is not the worst. But they get everything first. They knew about my podcast a month in advance. They knew about the podcast before some of my family and friends knew about it. So it's that exclusive. And I have a lot more projects and products and things coming in 2023. So if you're watching this in the future, things are probably already out and available. So go to transactioncare.com to find out more, to stay in contact with me. So if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'm more than glad and open to answering them. And make sure you like, share, comment, and subscribe. Tell a friend, tell a friend, tell a friend. Your time is worth it. Let's coordinate. Care for yourself, care for your wealth. Lily. TC with Lily, your TC bestie. We'll see how that feels.